The vote was 43-0, and I watched every single hand rise against us. I stood in the observation gallery of Station Orlan, Earth's first and only diplomatic outpost beyond our solar system, and I watched the Galactic Concord Grand Senate condemn 7 billion people to slavery. The holographic tally floated above the chamber floor in cold blue light. Resolution 7714, they called it. The formal reclassification of Homo sapiens as harvestable labor stock. Not a single species abstained. Not one delegate hesitated. 43 civilizations looked at humanity and decided, unanimously, that we were better off in chains. My name is Elias Voss. I was a commander in Earth's Unified Defense Council. I had been stationed on Orlan for 4 months as part of our diplomatic security detail. We had been members of the Galactic Concord for 11 months. 11 months of smiling at species who had already decided our fate before we walked through the door. The chamber erupted in what passed for applause among a dozen different biologies. Limbs slapped against torsos. Proboscises vibrated. Bioluminescent patches flared across scaled hides. They were celebrating. I pressed my palm flat against the observation glass and felt it tremble from the resonance of their joy. Grace Aldridge grabbed my arm. She was our senior diplomatic attaché, a woman who had spent 2 decades negotiating trade agreements on 3 continents, and I had never seen her face that pale. She said one word: run. I did not argue. We made it 17 steps down the corridor before the Draven security forces cut us off. 8 soldiers in black reactive armor, each one standing nearly 2 meters tall, with 4 arms that ended in clawed gauntlets. The squad leader told us to kneel. Grace started to say something about diplomatic immunity, and he hit her across the mouth with the back of his gauntlet. She dropped. I caught her before she hit the deck and felt 2 of her teeth come loose against my palm. They seized every human on the station within 9 minutes. 14 diplomats, 6 security personnel, including me, 3 maintenance workers, 2 cooks. They lined us up in a cargo bay and stripped us of our uniforms. A technician from the Orvani Dominion walked down the line and fitted each of us with a neural compliance collar. It was a thin band of dark metal that locked around the base of the skull. When he activated mine, every muscle in my body seized at once. The pain lasted only 2 seconds, but it was enough to make me understand what the collar could do if I disobeyed. The technician noted my physical readings on a tablet with the clinical detachment of a farmer tagging livestock. Height, weight, bone density, muscle mass, cortisol levels. He flagged me as a high-resistance risk based on my military background and recommended an elevated collar sensitivity for my unit. He processed all 25 of us in under 30 minutes. Then they separated us. France was loaded onto a transport heading for an industrial world in the mid-rim. Peter Harmon was sent to a labor camp on a desert planet whose name I could not pronounce. The youngest member of our team, a cultural liaison named Maya Ashford, was assigned to an agricultural processing facility in the Outer Territories. She was 23 years old, and she looked at me through the viewport of her transport as it pulled away from the station, and the expression on her face was not fear. It was a cold, focused anger that I recognized because I felt the same thing in my own chest. While we knelt on that cargo bay floor, the combined enforcement armada was already in transit to Earth. Over 9,000 warships drawn from 12 contributing species, they had been assembling for weeks. The vote was a formality. The invasion had been planned long before any delegate raised their hand. Earth's fleet fought for 9 hours. I learned the details later, from intercepted transmissions and whispered reports in the labor camps. We had 6 destroyers, 2 carriers, and a scattering of orbital defense platforms that had been built more as a statement of ambition than any real military capability. Against 9,000 warships, it should have lasted 9 minutes. It lasted 9 hours, because humans do not surrender well. Our destroyers ran straight at the armada in formations that no sane species would attempt. They targeted engine clusters and ammunition stores, aiming for maximum damage per engagement rather than survival. Captain Peter Harmon, of the destroyer Carthage, rammed his ship into the flagship of the Draven Second Fleet after his weapon systems failed, crippling a vessel 60 times his size. The explosion killed him instantly, but took 400 Draven crew with him. Lieutenant Maya Ashford piloted a damaged carrier into a tight orbit around Earth's moon, and used the gravitational slingshot to accelerate into a group of troop transports, scattering their formation and delaying the ground invasion by 3 hours. 312 enemy vessels were destroyed or disabled. The Concorde had estimated losses in the single digits. 312 ships lost to a species that had possessed faster-than-light travel for less than a decade. But it was not enough. Earth fell. The ground invasion followed immediately. Concorde troop carriers descended through the wreckage of our orbital defense line and deployed occupation forces on every continent. The fighting on the surface lasted another 48 hours. Military units that had survived the bombardment fought from bunkers, basements, and rooftops. Civilian militias formed spontaneously in cities across the globe, armed with whatever they could find. But the collars were already being distributed. Concorde enforcement teams moved through urban centers with Orvani technicians, and every human they caught received a collar. Once collared, resistance became physically impossible. The neural override was absolute. Within a week, 7 billion humans wore collars. The planet that had produced Mozart and Shakespeare, and the theory of general relativity, was reclassified as Labor Processing Zone 17. The enslavement was efficient and bureaucratic, the way only a civilization that has done this many times before can be. Humans were sorted by physical capability, age, and skill set. Factory workers, field laborers, miners, technical staff, those deemed too old or too young to work were relocated to processing centers. I learned not to ask what happened in the processing centers. I was branded a Category 3 hazard due to my military background and shipped to a mining colony on Varath Kol, a frozen moon in the outer territories controlled by the Draven hegemony. The transport took 11 hours. We stood in the cargo hold the entire time, shoulder to shoulder, collars humming against our necks. No one spoke. Not because the collars prevented it, but because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already express. The surface temperature averaged -40 degrees. The mining complex was built into the frozen crust of the moon, a labyrinth of tunnels and processing chambers, connected by narrow corridors that were barely wide enough for 2 humans to pass each other. The mines ran 18 hours a day. We cracked mineral deposits with plasma picks under the supervision of guards who carried shock batons calibrated to work in concert with our collars. One wrong look, one slow step, one whispered word at the wrong moment, and the collar would drop you screaming to the ground. I saw it happen to a woman named Helen Garza on my 3rd day. She stumbled on a patch of ice in Corridor 9, and the guard interpreted the stumble as defiance. The collar fired. She was on the ground for 4 seconds, and when she stood up, there was blood running from her nose, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the plasma pick. She went back to work without a word. She did not stumble again. They packed 217 humans into barracks, designed for 80. The bunks were stacked 3 high, with less than half a meter between each level, and the heating system was calibrated for Draven physiology, which meant it kept the barracks at a temperature that was technically above freezing, but felt like sleeping inside a refrigerator. The lights never fully went off. A dim blue glow stayed on around the clock, because the Draven believed that total darkness encouraged conspiratorial behavior among enslaved populations. They were right about that, but the blue light did not stop us. It just meant we learned to communicate without words, through glances and gestures, and the careful placement of objects that served as coded messages. Owen Bryce, a structural engineer from Perth, was the first person I spoke to on Varath Kol. He was bleeding from a gash above his eye, where a guard had struck him during intake processing. I pressed a strip of fabric against the wound and asked him how long he thought we would last. He looked at me with one swollen eye and said he had already counted 4 blind spots in the guard rotation between the barracks and the main shaft. He said the Draven changed shifts every 6 hours, and there was a 40-second gap when the North Corridor was completely unmonitored. He had been on Varath Kol for 3 hours. That was the moment I understood something the Concorde never would. They had enslaved dozens of species over 12,000 years. Every one of those species had broken within a generation. The collars worked. The quotas worked. The systematic erasure of identity and autonomy worked on every sentient being the Concorde had ever encountered. They had never encountered humans. Other enslaved species went silent because they were broken. We went silent because we were listening. I watched the humans around me adapt to the colony with a speed that should have terrified the Draven if they had been paying attention. Within a week, every human on Varath Cole knew the name of every guard, the location of every camera, the timing of every shift change, and the exact duration of every gap in surveillance coverage. We did not share this information openly. We did not need to. We gathered it independently, instinctively, the way a trapped animal studies the walls of its cage, and when our observations overlapped, we confirmed them with a look that lasted less than a second. I started counting the seconds of every gap in surveillance. I memorized guard names, shift schedules, the calibration frequencies of the collars. I noted which guards were cruel and which were merely indifferent, because indifference could be exploited and cruelty could be predicted. I mapped the ventilation system by listening to the airflow during quiet hours. I tested the mechanical locks on the maintenance hatches by brushing against them during shift changes and feeling which ones rattled and which ones held firm. I cataloged every weapon I saw, every access card, every communication device, and calculated which ones could be seized in under 5 seconds and which ones would require more time. I watched and I waited and I planned, because that is what humans do when you put them in a cage. They do not despair. They do not accept. They study the bars, they measure the locks, and they start building the key. The Draven Guard commander on Varath Cole once told me that the collar made resistance impossible. I smiled at him and agreed. He never noticed that I was counting the steps between his office and the armory while I said it. 6 months into our enslavement, I had mapped every guard rotation, every sensor blind spot, and every maintenance tunnel in the Varath Cole mining complex. I knew which ventilation shafts connected to the communications room. I knew which power conduits fed the collar control array. I knew the name and rank of every guard on every shift, and I knew which ones drank stolen colony liquor during the overnight watch. But I was not planning a local breakout. A local breakout would free 217 humans on one frozen moon and accomplish nothing. The Concord would send a recovery fleet, recapture everyone within a week, and execute the ringleaders as an example. I had watched them do exactly that to a group of Tasari laborers on a mining platform in the adjacent system 4 months earlier. 16 workers tried to overwhelm their guards during a shift change. The Concord response was immediate and absolute. They killed the 16 workers and then killed 16 more at random, to make the math clean. I was building something bigger. Humans had been distributed across 211 worlds as slave labor. The Concord considered this efficient resource allocation. From their perspective, scattering us across the galaxy eliminated any possibility of organized resistance. No species had ever coordinated a rebellion across more than a single world. The distances were too vast, the communications too tightly monitored, and the collars made even local resistance virtually impossible. They did not understand what they had done. They had planted us everywhere. Every enslaved species before us had been broken by isolation. The Crethan, enslaved 600 years ago, had been scattered across mining worlds where they never saw another free Crethan again. Within 2 generations, they had forgotten what freedom felt like. The Tasari had been indentured through economic manipulation, their debt structures so complex that they could not even calculate what they owed, let alone resist the system that bound them. Every species that entered the Concord's machinery came out the other side compliant, because the machinery was designed by 12,000 years of refinement to produce exactly that result. But humans are different. We do not need to see other free humans to remember what freedom is. We carry it inside us like a heartbeat, constant and involuntary. You can put us in chains on opposite sides of the galaxy, and we will independently, without communication or coordination, begin working toward the same goal. Not because someone told us to, because resistance is not a strategy for humans, it is an instinct. Danya Sobol was the one who made it possible. She was an electrical engineer from Odessa who had been assigned to maintain the power grid on Varath Cole because the Draven considered her skills too valuable to waste in the mines. She spent her first 3 months studying the collar system from the inside. By the 4th month, she had identified the encrypted frequency that the control array used to communicate with each individual collar. By the 5th month, she had built a transmitter from salvaged mining equipment parts that could mimic that frequency. By the 6th month, she could turn any collar on Verath Cole off. She told me this during a 19-second gap in surveillance coverage near the waste processing facility, while pretending to check a conduit junction box. She said it in a voice so calm that I almost missed the magnitude of what she was describing. She could free us, all of us, but only on Verath Cole. I asked her how she had done it. She explained it to me in fragments, spread across a dozen more conversations over the following week. The collars operated on an encrypted frequency that cycled through 2 million possible channels every 30 seconds. The encryption was designed to be unbreakable without a dedicated computing array that no slave could possibly access. Danya did not have a computing array. She had a salvaged oscilloscope built from mining equipment components, and a brain that processed frequency patterns the way most people process language. She recorded the collar's output over 14 consecutive shift changes, identified the pseudo-random seed that generated the cycling pattern, and reverse-engineered the control protocol. She did the entire analysis in her head, because she had no other option. She told me later that the math was not difficult. The difficult part was doing it while swinging a plasma pick in 18-hour shifts, and pretending to be broken. I told her that was not enough. She stared at me for a moment and then nodded. She already knew. The resistance network grew in ways the Concord could not have predicted, because they could not have imagined it. Humans smuggled microtransmitters in tooth fillings, in the hollowed-out heels of work boots, in the lining of the thin thermal blankets the Draven issued to prevent us from freezing to death in the barracks. Each transmitter was crude, limited to a range of a few hundred meters, but when you chain them together across a planet and then bounce that signal off a maintenance satellite that no one bothers to monitor, because it handles sewage telemetry, you get something extraordinary. You get a network. The Concord had studied human psychology. They had files on our social structures, our communication patterns, our response to authority and coercion. Their behavioral analysts had concluded that humans were a hierarchical species that would fragment without central leadership, that our resistance capacity was directly proportional to our organizational structure, and that destroying the structure would eliminate the resistance. They were wrong about all of it. Humans do not need a leader to resist. We do not need a plan. We do not need permission. Put two humans in a room with a shared problem, and they will find each other, communicate, and begin working on a solution before any authority tells them to. It is not a choice. It is what we are. The Concord eliminated our hierarchy and expected us to fall apart. Instead, we became a flat network, a distributed organism with no head to cut off and no center to target, and every node in that network was doing the same thing independently, learning, watching, waiting, and preparing. Each cell was small, 5 to 20 humans on any given world, but each cell was doing exactly what I was doing on Verath Cole. They were learning. They were watching. They were counting the seconds. On the Agri-World Tesseran, a 17-year-old from Accra named Kofi Mensah had been assigned to the grain fields. His job was to walk behind a harvesting machine for 14 hours a day, picking up stalks that the machine missed. It was mindless, degrading labor designed to crush the spirit. Kofi used every step to map the planetary defense grid. He memorized patrol routes, satellite positions, weapon emplacements, and communications relay locations. He could not write any of it down, so he kept it all in his head. When his cell leader asked him to reproduce the defense grid from memory, he drew it on a dirt floor in perfect scale. Every installation, every patrol route, every blind spot. He was 17 years old, and he had memorized an entire planet's military infrastructure while picking up grain. On the fuel processing station, orbiting the gas giant Kelvor, a chemical engineer named Adana Okafor discovered that the coolant system she maintained fed directly into the station's reactor containment field. One precise alteration to the flow rate would not cause an explosion, but would force an emergency shutdown that would take 6 hours to recover from. 6 hours without power meant 6 hours without collar signals. She mapped 3 alternative shutdown sequences so that if one was detected, the others would still function. On the Concord capital world itself, a human translator named Lian Shu had been assigned to the Senate filing office. Her job was to catalog and archive communication logs from Senate proceedings. The Concord assigned her this task because they considered humans too primitive to understand the political significance of what they were reading. Leon held 2 graduate degrees in xenolinguistics and a photographic memory. Within 3 months, she had read and memorized every classified Senate communication from the past 2 years. She knew troop deployment schedules, supply chain vulnerabilities, political fractures between member species, and the personal scandals of 14 senior Senate officials. She filed everything correctly and never gave any indication that she understood a single word. On the communications relay station above Dren, a signals technician named Nathan Cross had been forced to repair and maintain the very systems that jammed human transmissions across the sector. He fixed everything they asked him to fix. He also installed a secondary relay hidden inside the main array housing that could broadcast on a frequency the Concord did not monitor because they had invented it themselves and then abandoned it as obsolete 40 years ago. That abandoned frequency became the backbone of our network. On the shipyard moon of Calic, humans who had been forced to weld hull plating and install drive cores on Concord warships were learning something their overseers never considered a risk. They were learning to fly the ships they were building. Ruth Patterson, a former cargo pilot from Brisbane, spent her unpaid overtime shifts sitting in the cockpit of a half-finished heavy cruiser, memorizing the control layout. The guards never stopped her because the ship had no fuel and the hangar doors were sealed. They did not know that her welding team had spent 3 weeks modifying the hangar door controls so they could be opened from inside the cockpit. They did not know that another team had been diverting fuel from the refinery in quantities too small to trigger inventory alerts, storing it in maintenance bays that the dock supervisors had not inspected in years. And they certainly did not know that Ruth had trained 47 other welders to crew the ship by breaking down every system into a set of memorizable procedures that each person practiced in their head during their labor shifts. The Concord's contempt was our greatest asset. They did not watch us because they did not believe we were worth watching. They put us in the most sensitive facilities in the galaxy because they needed labor, and they never considered that the labor was studying every system it touched. We did not resist. We did not protest. We did not give any sign that we were anything other than the broken, compliant workforce they expected. We were the perfect slaves, right up until the moment we stopped being slaves entirely. The information flowed slowly through the network. A phrase here, a data burst there, always disguised as background noise, in systems the Concord had stopped monitoring. Each cell confirmed its capabilities independently. Each cell reported its readiness through a chain of relays that crossed dozens of systems and passed through hundreds of human hands. No single person knew the full picture. No single capture could compromise the network. The network was humanity itself, distributed across 211 worlds, connected by a shared determination that no collar could suppress and no distance could break. I coordinated from Varath Cole, receiving fragments and assembling them into a plan that I kept entirely in my memory. Nothing was written down. Nothing was stored digitally. The plan existed only in the minds of cell leaders across 211 worlds, and each one knew only their own piece. If any single cell was compromised, the others would continue. If any leader was captured, they could reveal only their local operation. The network had no center. It had no hierarchy. It was a web of autonomous units, connected by a shared purpose and a shared signal, and it was invisible to every surveillance system the Concord had ever built. The hardest part was the timing. Each world operated on its own rotational cycle, its own day-night rhythm, its own pattern of guard shifts and maintenance windows. The signal had to reach every cell at the same galactic standard moment, but execution had to match local conditions. On Tesseran, the optimal strike window was during the midday meal break, when guards were at minimum. On Calic, it was during the overnight maintenance cycle, when the shipyard docks were sealed. On the Concord Capitol, it was during the morning legislative session, when the Senate was in full attendance and building security oriented outward rather than inward. Danya spent 3 weeks developing a universal collar kill protocol that could be adapted to each facility's specific control frequency. She transmitted the adaptation instructions through the network in fragments, each disguised as static noise in routine maintenance transmissions. The engineers in each cell assembled the protocol from the fragments and confirmed readiness through the relay chain. It took 6 months. On the final night before Liberation Day, I received the last confirmation through a relay chain that had passed through 47 human cells across 9 star systems. Every cell reported ready. 211 worlds, thousands of humans, each one prepared to act at the same moment. I set the timetable. The signal would be a single word transmitted on the abandoned Concord frequency that Nathan Cross had resurrected. The word was daybreak. When it was broadcast, every cell would execute simultaneously. We would have a 90-second window on most worlds between collar deactivation and the first armed response. 90 seconds to seize weapons, communications, and key infrastructure. 90 seconds to turn 6 months of planning into reality. That night, I stood in the barracks on Varath Cole and looked at the frozen sky through a crack in the wall plating. 217 humans slept around me, their collars glowing faintly in the dark. By this time tomorrow, those collars would be dead. Or we would be. The Concord built their empire on one assumption. They assumed that slaves stay broken. They had 12,000 years of evidence to support that assumption. Every species they had ever chained eventually accepted the collar as permanent. Every rebellion they had ever faced was local, disorganized, and easily crushed. They had never enslaved a species that gets more dangerous the harder you push it. They had never encountered a predator that uses captivity as a classroom. Tomorrow, they would learn. The word daybreak went out at 0600 Standard Galactic Time, broadcast on a frequency the Concord had abandoned 4 decades ago. It reached 211 worlds in under 90 seconds, and on every single one of those worlds, humans moved. On Varath Cole, Danya Sobel sent the kill signal from a transmitter she had hidden inside a conduit junction box near the power grid control room. 217 neural compliance collars went dead simultaneously. The guards did not notice for 11 seconds. They were accustomed to quiet. They expected quiet. Humans in collars were always quiet. Those 11 seconds cost them everything. I had already briefed every human in the complex during the previous week, using whispered conversations during the 6-second gaps between surveillance sweeps. Each person knew their role. Each person knew exactly where to be, and exactly what to do when the collars went silent. In the first 3 seconds, I grabbed a plasma pick from the mining rack nearest my bunk. Owen Bryce grabbed 2 more and tossed one to Danya. By the 5th second, we were moving through the North Corridor during the 40-second surveillance gap that Owen had identified on his first day. By the 8th second, we reached the guard station at the junction of Corridor 7 and the main shaft access tunnel. There were 2 Draven guards inside, both facing their monitoring screens, both completely unaware that every collar in the complex had just died. Owen hit the door release. I went through low and fast. The first guard turned toward me, and I drove the plasma pick into his console, shorting the alarm panel. The second guard reached for his shock baton, and Owen was already behind him. It was over in 4 seconds. We had the guard station, the alarm panel, and 2 sidearms. By the time the Draven Central Command realized something was wrong, 40 armed humans were moving through the Varath Coal mining complex in coordinated teams, following routes they had memorized over 6 months of careful observation. Team Alpha secured the communications room. Team Beta locked down the armory. Team Gamma disabled the external sensor array so the complex could not send a distress signal. Team Delta seized the landing pad, where 3 Draven transport ships sat fueled and ready. The Draven garrison commander activated the emergency collar pulse. Nothing happened. Danya had not merely turned the collars off. She had burned out the control array entirely. The collars were dead metal now, nothing more than cold bands around our necks. The garrison fell in 22 minutes. 38 Draven soldiers surrendered. 12 fought and were killed. Not a single human died. We took the complex, the communications array, the armory, and every ship on the landing pad. But Varath Cole was one moon. What mattered was everything else. On Tesserin, Kofi Mensa and his cell of 11 humans overwhelmed the guards at the Planetary Defense Grid Control Center using nothing but farming tools and the element of total surprise. Kofi's memorized map of the defense grid proved flawless. His team activated the orbital defense guns and turned them on the Concord garrison fleet in orbit. 3 destroyers and a troop carrier were destroyed before they could raise shields. The remaining garrison ships fled to the system's edge and sent a panicked transmission to Concord Command, reporting that Tesserin's own defense grid had turned against them. On the fuel station orbiting Kelvor, Adana Okafor triggered her carefully planned reactor shutdown sequence. The station went dark for 6 hours. In the blackout, every caller on the station died. 43 humans overwhelmed the 12-person guard detail, using tools from the maintenance bay. They restarted the reactor under their own control and locked every docking port, effectively seizing the primary fuel depot for an entire sector. On the communications relay station above Dren, Nathan Cross activated his hidden secondary relay and began broadcasting on every Concord military frequency simultaneously. He transmitted a single message on a continuous loop. The humans have risen. The callers are dead. Every species that profits from chains should start counting its days. The message reached every Concord military installation within minutes. It was the first time in 12,000 years that a slave species had broadcast on military channels. On the shipyard moon of Kalek, Ruth Patterson climbed into the cockpit of the heavy cruiser she had been studying for months. Her welding team opened the hangar doors from inside, exactly as they had planned. Ruth brought the engines online, lifted the cruiser out of the construction bay, and flew it directly over the Concord security barracks. She did not fire. She did not need to. The sight of their own half-finished warship hovering above them, crewed by the slaves who had built it, was enough. The garrison surrendered within 3 minutes. Ruth's team seized 11 more ships in various stages of completion, and the engineers among them began finishing the work under their own direction. On the Concord capital world, Lian Shu waited until the Senate was in full session. She walked to the chamber's environmental control panel, entered an access code she had memorized from a classified maintenance log 3 months earlier, and sealed every exit. The 43 delegations that had voted to enslave humanity were now locked inside their own chamber. The irony was precise and deliberate. Lian had planned it for months, choosing the exact moment when every species would be present, when the chamber would be full, when the sealed doors would carry the maximum symbolic weight. Then she walked to the public broadcast terminal in the Senate filing office and transmitted humanity's Declaration of Liberation on every civilian channel in the galaxy. The declaration was 5 sentences long. It stated that humanity rejected Resolution 7714, that every human being in Concord space was now free, that any attempt to re-enslave any human would be met with force, that humanity demanded the immediate release of all enslaved persons of every species, and that the Galactic Concord, as currently constituted, was dissolved. Inside the Senate chamber, 43 delegations listened to the declaration being broadcast on their own communication system by a species they had classified as too primitive to understand the documents they were filing. The Concord speaker attempted to activate the chamber's override controls and discovered that Lian had disabled them using a maintenance code from a procedural document she had filed and memorized 4 months earlier. The speaker then attempted to contact external security and discovered that the communication relay serving the Senate building was broadcasting Lian's declaration instead of routing calls. Nathan Cross's work on the Dren relay station had cascaded through the entire communications infrastructure. Lian transmitted it, walked back to her desk, and sat down. She had been filing documents the entire time. No one in the building knew she had done it until the broadcast reached the Senate chamber itself, and by then, the doors were sealed. The Concord military response was frantic and uncoordinated. They scrambled fleets from 18 systems, but every fleet faced the same problem. Their communication relays were compromised. Their fuel depots were seized or shut down. Their defense grids had been turned against them. They had never planned for this scenario because it had never occurred to them as a possibility. A simultaneous, coordinated uprising across more than 200 worlds, executed by a species they had classified as primitive labor stock. Their strategic doctrine had no chapter for this. Their war simulations had never modeled it. In 12,000 years of galactic dominance, no enslaved species had ever done what humanity did that morning. Individual revolts had happened. They were always local, always desperate, always crushed within days. The Concord had entire protocols for slave uprisings, refined over millennia. Send the nearest fleet. Reactivate the callers remotely. Kill the ringleaders publicly. Increase caller sensitivity for the surviving population. Simple. Effective. Proven. None of those protocols worked when the uprising was everywhere, when the callers were dead on every world, when the slaves were flying the fleet's own warships, and when the communications systems that should have been coordinating the response were broadcasting the enemy's declaration of victory on every channel. Fleet Admiral Kethro of the Velthani scrambled 60 warships toward Tesseran, reasoning that recapturing the planetary defense grid would serve as a deterrent. His fleet arrived to find Kofi Mensah's captured orbital guns waiting for them, backed by 4 warships that Ruth Patterson's teams had launched from Calic and repositioned during the transit window. Kethro lost 11 ships in the first exchange and withdrew. While he was regrouping, humans seized the fuel depot he had left unguarded. He could not pursue because his ships no longer had enough fuel to reach the next friendly port. On the manufacturing world of Drain, 32 humans who had been forced to operate industrial machinery reprogrammed the factory's automated systems during the chaos. The robots that had been building consumer goods began building barricades. The Drain garrison found itself sealed inside its own compound by the same automation it had overseen the day before. I consolidated forces on Varath Kol and commandeered a Draven command cruiser that had been docked at the moon's orbital station. The crew had already evacuated when they saw their own mining complex flying our flag. Owen Bryce took the engineering section. Danya took communications. I took the command chair, and felt the absurd, furious joy of sitting in a seat that had been built for a species that had put me in chains 7 months ago. We gathered every ship we could, captured transports, stolen patrol boats, 2 heavy frigates that Ruth Patterson's team had finished and launched from Calic. It was a ragged fleet, crewed by miners and welders and farmers and translators, and it was the most dangerous fighting force the galaxy had ever produced. Not because of the ships, which were stolen and mismatched and in several cases still bearing the insignia of the species we had taken them from. Because of the crew. Every person aboard those ships had spent months in chains, learning the technology that confined them, studying the systems that oppressed them, and waiting for this exact moment. We did not need military training. We had something better. We had 7 months of fury channeled into absolute competence. I set course for Earth. The transit took 9 hours. During those 9 hours, I received reports from human fleets, converging from 31 other liberated systems. Ruth Patterson was bringing 12 ships from Calic. Kofi Mensah had commandeered a Concord frigate from Tesseran and was leading a smaller flotilla from the agricultural worlds. Nathan Cross had disabled the Drain relay's jamming function and was coordinating fleet movements across 3 sectors simultaneously. The galaxy-wide communication network that the Concord had built to maintain its empire was now serving as the command infrastructure for its destruction. The liberation of Earth took 14 hours. When we arrived, the occupation force in orbit was already weakened. Ground-level uprisings had begun the moment the daybreak signal reached the planet's surface. Humans who had been forced into labor camps, factory complexes, and agricultural processing centers rose up with whatever they could find. The Concord garrison had been built to suppress scattered resistance, not a coordinated planetary insurrection. Our fleet hit the orbital blockade from 3 vectors simultaneously. The Concord ships were better armed, but their crews were shaken. They had spent the last 12 hours receiving reports of human uprisings on world after world, and now humans were coming for them in ships they recognized as their own. The psychological impact was devastating. 2 Concord destroyers broke formation and fled before we fired a single shot. The battle raged across Earth's orbit for 14 hours. The first engagement was the hardest. Our 7 ships against an outer picket line of 40 Concord patrol vessels. We were outgunned, but not outmaneuvered. Owen Bryce, running our engineering section, pushed the reactor output beyond its rated maximum by reconfiguring the power distribution grid on the fly, using modifications Danya had designed during her months in the mines. Our weapons hit harder than the Concord expected. Our shields held longer. And our pilots, former miners and farmers and factory workers, who had learned to fly these ships by watching and memorizing and practicing in their heads during 18-hour labor shifts, flew with a ferocity that no military academy could teach, because it came from something deeper than training. It came from 7 months of chains. 3 hours into the battle, 12 more human ships arrived from behind the moon. 6 hours in, another 8 dropped out of transit from the direction of Mars. The Concord fleet, which had been confident in its numerical advantage, found itself fighting on multiple fronts as human ships appeared from every direction, each wave forcing them to reposition and stretch their lines thinner. They were losing the battle of attrition because their ships were operating at factory specifications, while ours had been improved. On the ground, humans who had spent 7 months in labor camps heard the explosions in the upper atmosphere and understood. They rose in every city on every continent. In factories, in agricultural compounds, in construction sites and processing centers, collared humans turned on their guards with tools and bare hands. The collars were dead. The guards did not know why, and the confusion cost them the critical seconds they needed to respond. We lost 4 ships, they lost 27. When the last Concorde vessel withdrew, the sky above every continent was clear for the first time in 7 months. I stood on the bridge of the captured command cruiser and looked down at the blue curve of Earth through the forward viewport. There were fires burning on 3 continents. The scars of occupation were visible from orbit. But the planet was ours again. And then I made the decision that changed everything. I did not order the fleet to stand down. I did not declare victory and begin rebuilding. I looked at the tactical display showing Concorde fleet movements across the galaxy, and I gave the order to press outward. We had 62 captured warships, dozens of seized orbital defense grids, and control of critical fuel depots and communication relays across major trade routes. More importantly, our engineers had spent months studying Concorde technology from the inside, and they had not merely learned it, they had improved it. The ships Ruth Patterson's teams had finished on Calic were faster and harder hitting than their Concorde design specifications. Danya Sobel's modifications to the weapons systems on our captured cruisers increased their effective range by 30%. We were not going to conquer. We were going to make sure no one could ever do this to us again. The Concorde had taught us something valuable in those 7 months of slavery. They had taught us exactly how their empire worked, where its weaknesses were, and how to take it apart piece by piece. Over the following weeks, our fleet expanded as we captured more ships, liberated more human populations, and incorporated more freed slaves into our crews. The formerly enslaved species were watching us, with a mixture of awe and calculation. The Crethan sent a delegation to our flagship, asking if they could join the campaign. I accepted. The Tesserae offered logistical support. I accepted that too. What had begun as a human liberation was becoming something larger, a coalition of the formerly chained, moving through the galaxy with the momentum of 12,000 years of compressed rage finally released. We did not need to fight for most of the systems we claimed. The Concorde military was in full retreat. Commanders who had spent their careers suppressing slave populations were now facing those same populations, armed with the weapons and knowledge that had been used to control them. Many chose to withdraw rather than fight. Some chose to surrender. A few chose to fight and discovered, in the final moments before their ships broke apart, that the species they had classified as primitive labor stock had improved the weapons that were destroying them. A Concorde admiral sent a panicked transmission to the Grand Senate that was intercepted by Nathan Cross on the Dren relay. The admiral reported that the humans had not only freed themselves, but were advancing across multiple sectors. The ships they had captured were performing beyond original specifications. The weapons had been modified. The tactical patterns they were deploying had no equivalent in any Concorde military database. The transmission ended with a sentence that I later had framed and mounted on the bridge of every ship in our fleet. The admiral said, in a voice tight with something between awe and terror, that the Concorde had made a critical error in its assessment of humanity. They had classified humans as a labor resource. They should have classified them as a weapon. 3 months after Liberation Day, the Galactic Concorde existed in name only. Humanity controlled 31 strategic star systems, every major fuel depot along the galactic spine, and the 2 largest shipyards in Concorde space. We had not fired on a single civilian target. Every strike had been surgical. Military installations, slave processing facilities, government command nodes, communications infrastructure. We dismantled the machinery of the Concorde's power, with the precision of engineers taking apart a faulty engine. The economic collapse was faster than I expected. For centuries, the galactic order had run on slave labor. Entire civilizations had been built on the backs of subjugated species. The Crethan handled heavy manufacturing. The Tesserae managed agricultural production. The Pelori ran sanitation and waste processing. Humans had been the latest addition, assigned to mining and construction because of our physical resilience, but we were not the foundation. We were the final load-bearing pillar in a structure that was already cracking. When that pillar was ripped away, everything above it shifted. The Crethan labor caste on 4 worlds refused to work within 2 weeks of our liberation. They had watched what humans did. They had seen slaves break their own collars and seize warships and liberate their own planet, and they realized something that 12,000 years of submission had made them forget. The collars only worked if you believed they were permanent. The Tassari indentured populations began organized strikes across their assigned agri-worlds. Production on Tesseran alone dropped by 70% in a single month. The Concord sent enforcement fleets, but their fleets were stretched thin, their fuel supplies disrupted, and their commanders were receiving daily intelligence reports about human fleet movements that made every other priority secondary. The cascade was self-reinforcing. Each species that stopped working made every other species more desperate, which made their economies more fragile, which made their populations more restless. The Draven could not mine their own resources because they had never developed the domestic labor force to do so. The Orvani could not process their own waste because they had outsourced sanitation to enslaved Pelori workers for 3 centuries. The Velthani could not maintain their own communication networks because they had relied on Tassari technicians for routine maintenance. The entire galactic civilization had been built on a division of labor that classified certain species as masters and others as tools, and when the tools walked away, the masters discovered that they had forgotten how to use their own hands. The Draven hegemony attempted a counterattack. Their second fleet, comprising 140 warships under the command of Vice Admiral Vareth Dole, moved against our position in the Kelvor fuel depot system. Vareth Dole had commanded Concord enforcement operations for 30 years. He had crushed rebellions on 9 worlds. He had personally overseen the enslavement of 2 species. He was considered the most experienced combat commander in the Concord military. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. Our modified weapons systems tore through his fleet's shields with an efficiency that his tactical officers could not explain. His ships were firing at targets that had already moved. His communications were jammed by countermeasures that used his own encryption protocols against him. His fleet lost 87 vessels in 40 minutes. He withdrew with 53 ships, most of them damaged. He sent a single transmission to Concord Command that said only that the human modifications to standard Concord weapons had rendered his fleet's defensive capabilities obsolete. The battle at Kelvor sent a shockwave through every military command structure in the galaxy. The Draven had fielded their best commander and their newest ships against a converted fuel station defended by former slaves, and they had been destroyed in less than an hour. The tactical analyses that circulated among Concord military officers in the following days painted a picture that none of them wanted to accept. Humanity had not just learned their technology. We had surpassed it. We had taken weapons designed by species with 10,000 years of engineering tradition and made them better in 6 months. The implications were terrifying, because if we could do that with weapons, we could do it with everything. The Draven High Council convened an emergency session and voted to seek terms. It was the first time in their species' history that they had voluntarily asked for peace. The Orvani Dominion, which had designed and manufactured the neural compliance collars used on every enslaved species in the galaxy, made a different calculation. Their intelligence services discovered that Danya Sobol had not merely cracked the collar encryption, she had reverse-engineered the entire system. Humanity now possessed the ability to manufacture and deploy neural compliance collars of our own. We had no intention of using them, but the Orvani did not know that. The possibility alone was enough. Their parliamentary council dissolved in emergency session as factions argued over whether to surrender immediately, flee the galaxy, or attempt a preemptive strike that every military analyst told them would result in their total annihilation. They chose a 4th option. They sat in their chambers and did nothing, paralyzed by a fear that was, for the first time in their history, directed at them. Simon Hale, our intelligence coordinator, compiled a daily briefing that I reviewed each morning aboard the command cruiser that now served as our mobile headquarters. Simon was a former analyst from Canberra, a quiet man who had spent his enslavement working as a janitor in a Draven administrative facility. He had used his access to read every document that passed through the building. His briefings were precise, comprehensive, and increasingly grim. Meanwhile, our engineering teams were transforming the captured technology at a pace that alarmed even our own scientists. Danya Sobol had established a research division aboard the Galactic shipyard that was reverse engineering every piece of Concorde technology we captured. Within 6 weeks, our engineers had improved Concorde shield generators by eliminating a power regulation bottleneck that alien designers had accepted for centuries. They redesigned the targeting systems on captured warships to process 3 times as many engagement variables as the standard Concorde software. They developed a new reactor cooling protocol that allowed our ships to sustain higher power output for longer durations without overheating. Each improvement was small on its own. Together, they meant our captured fleet was now qualitatively superior to anything the Concorde could field. The Concorde military analysts who reviewed the combat data from the Shen corridor engagement were stunned. Our ships had not merely performed beyond specifications. They had performed in ways that the original designers considered physically impossible. The Concorde had spent centuries refining their military technology through incremental improvement within established parameters. Our engineers, unconstrained by the institutional assumptions that limited Concorde innovation, had simply asked different questions and found different answers. The Concorde was fracturing along every existing fault line. Species that had cooperated for centuries were turning on each other, blaming one another for the decision to enslave humanity. The Draven blamed the Orvani for providing defective collar technology. The Orvani blamed the Senate for approving the resolution. The smaller species, the ones who had contributed only a vote and a handful of ships, were scrambling to distance themselves from the decision entirely. Several had already begun drafting formal apologies. The internal politics of each species were as chaotic as the galactic situation. On the Draven homeworld, a reform faction within the High Council was calling for Vareth Dole's court-martial, not because he lost the battle, but because he had participated in the enslavement at all. On the Orvani capital, massive protests erupted in the streets, as citizens demanded to know why their government had built the technology that had provoked the most dangerous species in the galaxy. On a dozen smaller worlds, governments that had voted for Resolution 7714 were replaced by emergency coalitions that ran on a single platform, immediate surrender to humanity before the situation got worse. The Concorde's intelligence apparatus, which had once monitored every communication channel in the galaxy, was now feeding information directly to us. Not because we had compromised their systems, though we had, because their own analysts were defecting. Concorde intelligence officers who had spent decades suppressing slave populations were now reading Simon Hale's daily briefings and concluding that cooperation with humanity was a better career strategy than continued resistance. 3 senior Concorde intelligence analysts delivered their entire operational database to our command cruiser within the first month. The database confirmed everything Lian Shu had memorized and more. Humanity's strategy was not conquest, it was dismantlement. We were removing the infrastructure of enslavement, system by system, and replacing it with nothing. We were leaving a vacuum and forcing each species to confront what their civilization looked like, without slave labor holding it up. Many of them did not like what they saw. Entire economic sectors collapsed overnight. Manufacturing output plummeted. Agricultural production fell below subsistence levels on worlds that had relied on forced labor for generations. Species that had considered themselves advanced and self-sufficient discovered that they had outsourced every difficult, dangerous, or unpleasant task to slaves, and without those slaves, they could not feed themselves. Food riots erupted on 3 Draven colony worlds within the first 6 weeks. The Orvani faced a complete breakdown of their waste processing infrastructure because every species they had once enslaved to handle that work had walked off the job. The irony was vicious and total. The masters were drowning in their own garbage because they had never learned to handle it themselves. The first delegation arrived 6 weeks after Liberation Day. The Pelori were a minor species, soft-voiced amphibians who had contributed only a single vote and 12 transport ships to the enslavement of Earth. Their ambassador, a trembling female named Sethi Ka, came aboard our command cruiser under a flag of truce and asked me for terms. I looked at her for a long time. The Pelori had not run the mines. They had not designed the collars. They had not commanded the fleets that burned our cities. All they had done was raise their hand when the Senate asked if humanity should be enslaved. They had voted yes, because everyone else was voting yes. Because it was easier to go along. Because they had never considered that the thing in chains might one day stand up and look them in the eye. I told Sethika that the terms were not mine to give. Humanity would speak with one voice, and that voice would address every species at once. I told her to go home and wait. She asked me what we intended. I told her she would find out at the same time as everyone else. She left the command cruiser with her delegation, and I watched her shuttle disappear into the dark between stars, and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite mercy, but existed in the complicated space between the two. She asked me what we intended. I told her she would find out at the same time as everyone else. She left the command cruiser with her delegation, and I watched her shuttle disappear into the dark between stars, and thought about the 43 hands that had risen against us in that Senate chamber. 43 votes that had turned 8 billion people into property. One of those votes had been hers. Over the following weeks, more delegations made contact. Some were apologetic, some were defiant. Some tried to negotiate individual deals, offering resources or intelligence in exchange for favorable treatment. I refused every offer. The Velthani, whose speaker had presided over the vote, sent a diplomatic communique requesting that any meeting be held on neutral ground. I denied the request. A coalition of 6 minor species attempted to negotiate collective terms through a shared channel. I denied that too. Each species would face us individually before they faced us together. On day 14, a Draven courier arrived with a proposal for a mutual security agreement. I read it, set it aside, and said nothing. The courier waited 4 hours before leaving. On day 19, intelligence from Simon Hale indicated 3 species were exploring a military alliance against us. Within 48 hours, all 3 abandoned the idea, not because we threatened them, but because the other 40 species made clear that anyone who provoked humanity would face consequences alone. The 3 sent their delegations the following week. Simon arrived on day 22 with a complete intelligence dossier compiled from Leon Shu's Senate archives. It contained detailed records of every species' participation in the enslavement. Not just the vote, but the logistics. Which species provided ships? Which supplied collar technology? Which designed the sorting protocols? Which profited most from human labor? He spread the files across a table in my quarters and said the delegations needed to see that we knew everything, not as a threat, as a foundation for what came next. He was right. Transparency was our strongest weapon, not the fleet, not the captured warships. The simple, devastating knowledge that we had read their mail, walked their corridors, filed their documents, and remembered every single detail. I set the date and broadcast it across every channel. Every species that had voted for Resolution 7714 had 30 standard days to send a delegation to Earth. Not to the Concord capital. Not to a neutral station. To Earth. To the planet they had invaded and occupied and scarred. If they wanted mercy, they would come to the world they tried to chain. The broadcast was clear. Attendance was not optional. Any species that failed to appear within the 30-day window would be considered hostile, and humanity would respond accordingly. I stood on the bridge after the transmission ended and watched the galaxy map update as, one by one, confirmations began arriving. They were coming. All of them. Some fast, some slow, some with their pride still intact, and some with nothing left but fear. 30 days. Then the galaxy would learn what humanity had decided to do with the power that had been handed to us by the very species that tried to use that power to destroy us. On the 30th day, I stood in the rebuilt assembly hall in Geneva and looked out through the tall windows at a city that was still healing. Construction cranes dotted the skyline where Concord bombardment had leveled entire blocks. The streets were clean, but the scars in the concrete were fresh. Humanity had spent the last 3 months rebuilding with the same intensity we had brought to the war, but some wounds do not close quickly. Outside the assembly hall, 43 alien delegations waited in separate holding areas. Every single species had come. Some had arrived within the first week, desperate and eager to position themselves as cooperative. Others had waited until the final hours, still clinging to the hope that some coalition might form to resist. None had. I carried a small notebook in the breast pocket of my uniform jacket. It contained 43 names, not the names of alien delegations or species or ambassadors, the names of humans who had died in the mines and camps and processing facilities during the 7 months of enslavement. 43 names out of thousands, one for each species that had voted to put us in chains. I had chosen each name carefully. They were people I had known, or people whose stories I had heard from survivors during the liberation. People whose deaths had been unnecessary, and brutal, and unremarkable in the bureaucratic machinery of enslavement. We brought the delegations in one at a time, over the course of 3 days. Each meeting took between 30 minutes and 2 hours. I conducted them personally, with Catherine Wells and Diego Reyes flanking me. Catherine Wells was a former naval officer from Halifax, who had spent her enslavement in a Concord weapons testing facility where humans were used as live targets to calibrate stun settings. She wanted the Draven homeworld blockaded until its population experienced what starvation felt like. Her position was calm, reasoned, and absolutely sincere. She did not raise her voice when she described watching a guard calibrate a stun rifle by firing it at a 12-year-old girl to see how many shots it took to cause organ failure. She simply stated the facts and waited for them to land. Diego Reyes was a former construction foreman from Santiago who had been forced to build Concord military barracks on occupied Earth. His crew had been worked in 16-hour shifts without adequate food or water. 3 of his people had died of heat exhaustion, while Concord overseers watched and recorded data on human endurance thresholds. Diego wanted the collars. Not as a permanent measure, he said, but long enough for each species to understand what it felt like to have your autonomy removed at the molecular level. Long enough to teach them. I understood both of them. I shared their anger. But I also knew that what we did in this room would define humanity for every generation that came after us. The Draven High Commander, Vareth Dole, came first. He had commanded the fleet that invaded Earth. He had overseen the mining operations on Vareth Coal. He had signed the orders that classified humans by labor category and assigned us to die in mines and factories and testing facilities. He entered the assembly hall flanked by 2 aides, and he could barely meet my eyes. He offered a formal apology on behalf of the Draven hegemony. He offered reparations in the form of mineral resources and ship components. He offered to surrender the officers responsible for the worst abuses at the mining colonies. He offered everything, except the one thing I wanted to hear, which was an honest explanation of why. I asked him. He said the Senate had voted. He said the Draven had followed established procedure. He said that humanity's reclassification was consistent with Concord precedent for species that had been deemed a security risk. I asked him if the 17-year-old girl from Lagos who collapsed on her 9th mining shift and was left to die on a frozen tunnel floor was a security risk. He did not answer. His hands remained flat on the table. His gaze dropped to the wood grain. For a being who had commanded fleets and overseen the enslavement of entire species, he looked very small in that moment, very aware that the universe he had built his career in no longer existed. The Orvani delegation came next. They arrived with their entire neural collar patent archive loaded onto a data crystal, which they presented to me as a gesture of good faith. They said they were willing to destroy all existing collar manufacturing equipment and share the technical specifications so that defensive countermeasures could be developed by any species. They were cooperative and efficient and completely terrified, because they understood that Danya Sobol had already rendered their technology obsolete and their only remaining value was compliance. I accepted the archive. I did not thank them. The Tassari ambassador came third. Her skin flushed a deep blue that her translator said indicated profound shame. She spoke for 40 minutes about the history of her species within the Concord, about the pressures that had led them to vote as they did, about the internal debates that had preceded the resolution. She was trying to explain, not to excuse. I listened to every word. When she finished, I told her that understanding why it happened was important, but it did not change that it happened. The Pelori ambassador, Sethi Ka, returned. She was the only delegate who wept. She told me that her species had voted for the resolution because they were afraid of being targeted next if they dissented. She said the Pelori had enslaved no one themselves, had run no camps, had administered no collars. She said her people were cowards for not voting against it, and she was right. And she knew it. Between delegations, I walked the corridors of the assembly hall and talked to the people who had fought beside me. Hiroshi Sato, who had coordinated the ground resistance in East Asia, told me that his fighters wanted justice, not revenge, and that the difference mattered. Adana Okafor, who had flown in from the Kelvor fuel station she still administered, said she did not care what the aliens wanted, only what would prevent this from happening again. Ruth Patterson, who had arrived in one of the warships she had stolen from Calic, said she would accept whatever decision we made, as long as it was unanimous among the human leadership. Unanimity was not easy. The debates behind closed doors were fierce. Catherine Wells and her faction argued that mercy without consequence was an invitation for repetition. History, she said, human history, was full of examples where the victorious forgave the defeated, and the defeated came back stronger and angrier and more determined than before. She wanted lasting structural damage to the military capabilities of every species that had participated. Diego Reyes and his supporters wanted the experience of enslavement to be shared. Not as cruelty, he insisted, but as education. He said no species could truly understand what they had done to humanity without feeling the collar. He said words like justice and empathy were empty, without the physical memory of what it meant to have your body controlled by someone else's machine. Simon Hale argued against both positions. He had the intelligence briefings. He knew the internal politics of every delegation. He told us that the Concord was already broken, and that its member species were more afraid of each other than they were of us. Punitive measures would push them into desperate alliances. Collar retribution would unite them against us. The smartest thing humanity could do, he said, was the thing no galactic power had ever done in 12,000 years: show restraint. Not because they deserved it, but because the galaxy needed to see that power did not always corrupt the species that held it. I listened to all of them. I weighed their arguments against the weight of the notebook in my pocket. 43 names, 43 people who would never know how this ended. The debates ran deep into the nights. Lian Shu arrived on the second day, having flown from the Concord capital world where she still maintained a presence in the Senate building. She brought a perspective that none of us had considered. She said the aliens were not just afraid of our military power. They were afraid of our competence. They had watched a filing clerk lock their Senate, a teenager capture a planetary defense grid, a welder steal a warship, and an engineer crack their most advanced encryption in her head. They were terrified not because we could destroy them, but because we understood their civilization better than they did. We had spent 7 months inside their systems, reading their documents, building their ships, learning their routines, and we had mastered every aspect of their empire, while they assumed we were too primitive to notice. That understanding was our greatest weapon, and they knew it. Danya Sobel, who had traveled from Verath Kol for the summit, was quieter than the others. She sat in the corner during the debates and said very little. When I asked her what she thought, she said the collars were the only thing that mattered. Not using them, not building them, destroying every single one, and making sure no species ever had the ability to control another species' nervous system again. Everything else, she said, was politics. The collars were the point. On the third day, we brought all 43 delegations into the assembly hall together for the first time. They filled the chamber in a tense, silent mass of alien bodies and alien fears. Some were tall and armored, some were small and translucent. Some breathed the hall's atmosphere comfortably, and some wore filtration masks. All of them looked at me with the same expression, an expression I had seen on human faces in the mines and camps. They were waiting to be told what would happen to them, and they were afraid. I stood at the podium and took the notebook from my pocket. I read the 43 names aloud. I said each one clearly, with a pause between them, so that the translation systems in every delegation's earpiece could render each name in their own language. Some of the names were simple, some were long. All of them belonged to people who had been alive before Resolution 7714 and were dead because of it. The chamber was silent when I finished. I returned the notebook to my pocket and looked out at 43 species and spoke. I told them that every person in the human leadership had considered retribution. I told them that retribution had been earned. I told them that humanity had the military capability to enforce any terms we chose, up to and including the complete dismantlement of every civilization represented in this room. I said this without anger, because it was simply true, and truth did not require volume. Then I told them what we had decided instead. There would be 3 conditions. They were not negotiable. They were not open to amendment or appeal. They would be accepted unanimously, or they would be enforced unilaterally. First, the complete and permanent dismantling of every slave trade infrastructure, every compliance technology, every legal framework that permitted the ownership of sentient beings. Not just for humans, for every species, on every world, without exception. The collars would be destroyed. The processing centers would be demolished. The legal classifications of harvestable labor stock and indentured resource, and every other euphemism for slavery, would be stricken from every law and every charter in the galaxy. Second, reparations. Not in resources or currency, because we had taken enough of those ourselves. Reparations in knowledge. Every species in this room would open their scientific and cultural archives to humanity, without restriction. The deliberate quarantine of information that had kept enslaved species technologically primitive would end permanently. Knowledge was the only form of reparation that created value, rather than redistributing it, and humanity intended to create a great deal of value. Third, a new galactic charter, drafted and ratified by every species in this room, with a single founding clause. Any species that voted to enslave another would forfeit its sovereignty. Permanently. No appeal, no exception, no grandfathering. The charter would be enforced by a joint military authority with human oversight, and any species that violated it would cease to exist as an independent political entity. I paused and let the translations catch up. I watched 43 delegations process what I had said. Some looked relieved, some looked stunned. A few looked as if they were calculating whether they could live with these terms, and I watched them realize, one by one, that the alternative was worse. The Draven High Commander was the first to stand. He accepted. The Orvani followed, then the Pelori, then the Tessari, then the rest, one after another, in an unbroken chain of ascent that took 12 minutes to complete. 43 species had voted unanimously to enslave humanity. Now 43 species voted unanimously to accept our terms. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. The Crethan observers in the gallery applauded. It was the first sound from the gallery in 3 days, and it carried the weight of a species that had been enslaved for 600 years, and was watching, for the first time, a future where enslavement was not just illegal, but existentially dangerous for any species that attempted it. After the chamber emptied, I stood at the podium alone for a long time. The translation systems had gone silent. The ventilation hummed softly overhead. The chairs where 43 delegations had sat were empty now, and the room felt larger without them, as if the absence of their fear had changed the dimensions of the space. Catherine Wells came to stand beside me. She asked if I was satisfied. I told her I was not sure satisfaction was the right word. I told her that I had wanted something more. Something that would make the rage feel finished, and I did not think that thing existed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that maybe that was the point. Maybe the rage was not supposed to feel finished. Maybe carrying it was the cost of choosing mercy, and maybe that cost was what made the mercy real. Anyone could be merciful when it was easy. Choosing it when every cell in your body screamed for retribution, that was the version that mattered. I walked outside and stood on the steps of the assembly hall. The air smelled like rain and reconstruction dust. Across the city, lights were coming on in buildings that had been dark for months. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear music, human music. Someone playing a piano in an apartment that had survived the occupation with its windows intact. The sound drifted across the evening air, thin and clear, and impossibly beautiful against the backdrop of a city that was still learning to breathe again. I took the notebook from my pocket and held it for a long time. 43 names. They would never know what we had done in this room, what we had chosen, what we had sacrificed by choosing it. But every species in the galaxy would know, and every species would remember. The galaxy had expected humans to do what every dominant species in history had done, They expected us to take the throne and repeat the cycle. They feared we would be the cruelest masters of all, because we had proven, beyond any doubt, that we were the most dangerous species alive. But that was never the point. We did not fight to become the new slavers. We fought because the collar itched and because we looked around the galaxy and realized that every species in chains was waiting for someone to prove that the cycle could be broken. We broke it, not with a single act of heroism or a single moment of triumph, but with 1,000 small choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. A teenager memorizing satellite positions while harvesting grain. An engineer cracking encryption in her head while swinging a mining pick. A filing clerk reading every secret in the galaxy and using a maintenance code to lock the most powerful legislative body in existence inside its own building. A cargo pilot stealing a warship she had built with her own hands. A janitor reading classified documents while mopping floors. Thousands of humans scattered across hundreds of worlds, each one choosing resistance over resignation. Each one deciding that the collar was temporary even when everything around them said it was permanent. That is why every species in the galaxy now looks at humanity not with hatred or resentment, but with something far more complicated, something closer to awe, something that keeps them honest, keeps them careful, keeps them remembering what happens when you underestimate the species from the small blue world on the edge of the spiral arm. They do not beg for mercy because humanity is powerful. They beg because humanity is merciful, and that terrifies them more than any weapon ever could. Because a species that can choose mercy after everything we endured is a species that operates on a level of discipline and restraint that the galaxy has never encountered. And if we can exercise that kind of control over our own rage, then the galaxy understands, at a level deeper than logic, that there is nothing we cannot do. Let them remember that. Let them remember it every time they look at another species, and consider whether that species might be useful in chains. Let them remember the vote, and the collar, and the frozen mines, and the 17-year-old girl who died on a tunnel floor, and the fact that the species she belonged to came back from all of it, and chose to build something, instead of burning everything down. That is what humanity is, and the galaxy will never forget it.